This is definitely one of my favorite interviews of all time. Today we spoke to David A. Bell. He wrote Napoleon, a Concise Biography. This was a conversation that opened my mind to new ideas about Napoleon. He made me rethink the invasion of Russia, and I think you should watch this interview until the end. Every single minute is just full of knowledge. So I hope you enjoy it just like I did. Make sure to like and subscribe and enjoy, my friends. The last sentence of your book, it says what a novel his life was. When researching the book, did it sometimes feel like a thousand lives lived in one?
Uh, it often did. I mean, it's something about the period in general, I think, where I mean, there's a line that historians know where people say, well, there are some decades in which nothing happens, and then there are some weeks in which decades happen.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, there's this sense in the period from about the beginning of the French Revolution in 1789 until Napoleon's final overthrow in 1815, where people often at the time themselves talked about a sensation of time being compressed. The great writer Chateaubriand said we lived several centuries between 1789 and 1815. And if this was true for any character, it was particularly true for Napoleon Bonaparte. I mean, it's simply unbelievable what sort of a kind of compressed and active and busy life he led. Uh, I mean, he dies at age 50, at age 51. During and over the course of those 51 years, the things that he managed, the things he was involved in, simply, would have really filled many, many lifetimes. So yes, absolutely, it did feel like I was reading, in a sense, many lives compressed into one.
I want to first have a quick look into his childhood because I think in the childhood you kind of find out why the person became who he is. So, could you describe to me, David, what the childhood of Napoleon looked like? Like, what were the circumstances and what he was born into?
Well, the childhood of Napoleon's childhood falls into two very different parts. So he's born in 1769. He's born in Ajaccio, in the principal city in the island of Corsica. His parents are very well established members of what we could call the Corsican gentry, the sort of the Corsican lower nobility. Uh, the island has just been annexed by France. It had been independent for a number of decades. Before that, it had been ruled from Italy, from the Republic of Genoa. Uh, he's born into very comfortable circumstances, certainly. His parents are wealthy by Corsican standards. They are able to provide him with the kind of comforts you would expect for somebody in the 18th century. He is he's one of many children. It's a very large family. He's the second son. So the oldest son is Joseph, and his older brother. There were several children who did not survive, but that was again entirely typical for the 18th century, when most children, even born into comfortable circumstances, would probably have about a 50-50 chance of seeing their 20th birthday. So he has this very comfortable life up until age 10. And then something really remarkable happens, which is that his father, who's very ambitious for the family, realizes that now that they've been annexed by France, they are technically members of the French nobility, and they can take advantage of the programs that have been set aside for the French nobility to bring young men, in particular, into important positions in French society. So the father decides that Joseph, the older brother, will be destined by his character really for the priesthood. And then he decides that Napoleon will be destined for a military career. So at age 10, Napoleon is shipped off. I mean, his father actually takes him, but he goes off to a preparatory school in France, a boarding school, where people are going to be trained to eventually enter the École Militaire, the military school. And this is an enormous shock for him. As you could imagine, he's 10 years old. He's lived all his life in the bosom of his family, not going to school so much, but with tutors, surrounded, very, very much under the wing of his mother, who's a very domineering woman, very powerful personality, living with all of his brothers and sisters, a large extended clan of people. And then suddenly he is in this rather cold, um, very, very, very strict, austere boarding school atmosphere where people speak a different language, where they speak French rather than the Corsican Italian that he has been growing up with, where you have people who are going to look down at him very much for his accent, for his weird name, which was in Corsican would have been pronounced Napoleone, and then the last name would have been Bonaparte. He sort of the name is Frenchified to Napoleon, but the students tease him enormously about that. They call him La Paillonnet, which means straw in the nose, literally. And so this is a shock, and I think a lesser personality, somebody with a less strong personality, might have even been broken by this. But Napoleon was certainly not broken by it. He eventually makes friends. He survives in this atmosphere. He does very, very well in it, and stays in this school for I think about 6 or 7 years. I can't recall exactly, and then goes on to the military school where he's trained for a military career. So in that sense, the childhood is a period of testing for him, and it's certainly this shock of going to boarding school in France is something which very much toughens him and helps sort of set the adult personality in place.
And did Napoleon share like a glimpse of greatness, or was he quite average among all the other men at the boarding school?
So when Napoleon became famous, of course, it became, just about everybody who had known him in his early years realized that they had an opportunity to make some money by publishing memoirs or reminiscences of the early Napoleon Bonaparte. So, of course, everybody leapt into print with this. The most famous was a friend of his named Bourrienne, who became one of his aides later, who published a long series of memoirs of Napoleon, which starts with discussing their years at school. And the most famous bit of this is when he describes how Napoleon supposedly led a group of boys in a massive snowball fight where each side built forts and then pelted the other with snowballs. And of course, Napoleon, through a strategic genius that was already entirely visible at age 12 or 13, was able to overcome the opposition and win the battle. So we do have a lot of people who wrote about his childhood, but they tended to embroider the way that almost everybody would do so. And one of the great difficulties of actually writing about Napoleon's life is that there's so much that's simply made up about him. You can read memoirs from the period, which they're called memoirs, but they're really novels, where people simply would for example, memoirs of an old soldier. There must be 100 of these in French, and in almost every case, the old soldier seems to have seen Napoleon at every stage of his career, which is pretty unlikely for an army of hundreds of thousands of people.
Mhm.
So that's always an issue.
You also mentioned that Napoleon was quite a loner in the beginning of his boarding school, and you also wrote in your book that his best friends were mostly books, right?
Yes. So he was particularly a loner. I mean, we don't, at school, he seems to have been at least relatively social. But then when he became a teenager, he retreated into himself a bit. I think he was uncertain about what he really wanted to do in life. He discovered the world of books, he discovered the world of literature. And one thing about, again, that which people have to realize about Napoleon is that up until the French Revolution, he was assuming that his career options were actually fairly limited. Yes, he could be an officer in the French army, but he would never be a very high-ranking officer because he came from this little island, and he came from, a relatively unknown family there. So he was never going to be a general. He was never going to be probably a colonel. And he was already quite ambitious. But the other thing was that in reading, he discovered, a love of literature, a love of ideas. He also discovered a real Corsican patriotism. So he became increasingly attached to the idea, and I think this was partly in rebellion against, the kind of atmosphere he found himself in school. But he was very anti-French for a while, at least in his politics. He believed that Corsica should be an independent nation again, and he wanted to help bring that about, which would mean actually fighting against the country whose army he was being trained for. And he, at the same time, was reading novels, reading plays, reading memoirs, and thought that he might want to become a writer himself. So all of this made him into a fairly sort of bookish adolescent in some ways. And then when he was first received his commission from the French army and became an artillery officer, a very junior lieutenant artillery officer, he was sent to a bunch of really very boring posts where he didn't have a lot of people around him whom he liked. And so there particularly he retreated into himself, and that's when he wrote that I had, that my only friends were my books. And he wrote quite a lot too. I mean, he thought, I mean, he didn't really write in a very coherent manner, but he wrote a lot of things which he was hoping he might eventually be able to publish. So he wrote drafts of stories, drafts of novels, not entire novels, but pieces of them. He wrote essays. The most amusing thing that he wrote was actually early in the French Revolution. Uh, he wrote a kind of discourse on happiness that he sent into a learned academy to one of their essay contests. And in this discourse on happiness, among other things, he said, we have to guard against ambition, because ambition is a terrible thing. Ambition is a raging fire that devours everything in its path, and is really, really awful. Napoleon, that's really pretty.
Ironic.
Yeah. So at that point, yes, he was very much, very much in the world of books, and again was casting around for things that he might do later in life. And one idea that he had was to become basically a philosophe, a kind of intellectual.
Hmm. And what made him give up on that dream? Was it the taste of victory with his first battle, or what happened?
Well, I think that even before he first really went into battle, the enormous thing that changed for him was the French Revolution. Was the French Revolution. So again, up until 1789, when the French Revolution begins, Napoleon had been, really assuming that he would never be able to have a very satisfactory military career. It was certainly an option for him, but he would have probably gone on to become a captain, maybe a slightly above the rank of captain, and he would have had a fairly boring career unless he was lucky enough to do something extraordinary in battle, which wasn't necessarily on the cards under the old regime. But then comes the French Revolution, and everything breaks open. And two things break open in particular. One is that the most of the upper ranks of the army actually leave the army. Most of the high-ranking officers decide that they don't like the revolution, but they're mostly from the high ranks of the aristocracy. They decide they don't want to be part of this new revolutionary country. So many of them drop out of the army and go abroad. And the limits that had previously been placed on relatively low-ranking officers like Napoleon to rise up in the ranks are gone. So suddenly the chance of an actual military career is much greater for him. At the same time, another thing which happens is that Corsica now has a real chance of autonomy from France. So when the revolution begins, the first thing Napoleon does when he's able to is he takes leave from the army and he goes home, where he hasn't spent much time since he went there, since he left Corsica in 1780. But now he goes back to Corsica and he tries to get involved in the politics there. Because he's very eager to take a leading role in Corsican politics. So there are these two big new options that are available for him. And so at that point, the idea of being a writer seems much less interesting.
Hmm. And did he have any success in Corsica?
Well, he did for a while. So Corsica I mean, the first part of the French Revolution was decentralizing. So there was a great deal of devolution of power from the center to the département, to the colonies, and to places like Corsica. So Corsica gets a kind of, again, gets some institutions of its own that it didn't have before. And Napoleon does get involved very much in the politics. And he's particularly eager to take his place alongside the man who had been the ruler of independent Corsica before 1768. And this was a man named Pasquale Paoli, who was a kind of legendary figure in Corsica and whom Napoleon had read about. And Paoli had been exiled from Corsica. He'd been exiled to England since he had been defeated by the French. But now he's able to come back. The revolutionary authorities let him back in, and he immediately becomes again the dominant figure in Corsican politics. And Napoleon initially very much wants to be there by his side. And Napoleon is still very young at this point. I mean, he's only 20 years old. But he gets involved in Corsican politics. But what happens is that as the revolution continues, a split develops between not only Napoleon, but the entire Bonaparte family and Paoli. Because the Bonaparte family is more radical than Paoli. Paoli is older. He is above all committed to independence for Corsica or autonomy for Corsica. He doesn't really, want a full panoply of radical reforms in the revolution. Whereas Napoleon, and even more his younger brother Lucien, who's very active as well in Corsican politics, very much are Jacobins, and they very much are embracing, the kind of radical revolution, particularly after 1792, when the king is overthrown and France becomes a republic. So what happens is that in 1793, in the spring of 1793, the split in the revolution between the, a faction which is often considered to be relatively moderate, the Girondins, and the more radical Mountain associated with the Jacobin Club becomes really wide open and deadly. And Paoli is very much attached to the Girondins, whereas Napoleon and his family are more attached to the Jacobins, to the Mountain. And then Lucien Bonaparte in particular gives a very radical speech denouncing Paoli, and things really come to blows, and Paoli takes control of Corsica, and the Bonaparte family has to flee. All of them have to flee to the mainland. Mm-hmm. So basically in the late spring of 1793, just at the moment when the Girondins are actually being purged in Paris, the Bonapartes end up in France. And that's an absolutely decisive moment. At that moment, he basically, says, all right, I'm not going to have a future in Corsica. At that point, Paoli actually leads Corsica into a full-fledged rebellion against France. They invite in the British fleet. And the Bonapartes are in France and attached now to the Republic. And Napoleon himself, at that point, goes, full-fledged back into the French army, and just in time to take part in the siege of the city of Toulon, which is, Toulon was a major French port in the Mediterranean. It had been taken over by the British fleet. It had been invested, the port itself had been invested by the British army. And Napoleon takes part in the siege, which eventually liberates Toulon for the French Republic. And he plays a very crucial role there. He designs part of the strategy which his superiors accept, and behaves very heroically there. So that first really gets him attention among the revolutionaries. And in fact, Maximilien Robespierre's brother, who was there on the scene, writes a report back to Paris where he praises Napoleon, says, "This is an officer of transcendent merit." So this is really, again, another absolutely decisive moment for Napoleon, the spring of 1793.
So then Napoleon kind of enters the military and doesn't really have like a way back anymore. So he kind of like burned the bridges.
Absolutely.
And Napoleon, was he like did he like go full in, or was he still like a little?
At this point, he's really absolutely, well, okay. I mean, there will be moments over the next couple of years when he's wondering about where he should go. Because the revolution is a moment of continuous political change. It's a kind of carousel. So he is attached, particularly after Toulon, he's attached to Robespierre and Robespierre's brother. In the summer of 1794, Robespierre himself falls from power along with his allies. Robespierre is executed, and Napoleon is actually briefly imprisoned as a supporter of Robespierre. So when he's released from prison, he's wondering, is my career over now? What am I going to do? He's had a taste of real military success at this point. He's done very, very well at the siege of Toulon. So at this point, he's thinking, well, maybe I should go into some other army. So he actually flirts with the idea that he would basically hire himself out to the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire and go to Turkey and fight for the Ottomans, as a lot of Western European officers had done. But then soon enough, he is able to get back into the favor of the new revolutionary authorities. And so he never really ends up, taking that very seriously. And the next really important thing that happens is that he goes to Paris. Eventually, he is taken up by a man named Paul Barras, who is a leading member now in the post-Robespierre, the post-terror government of France. And Barras, as I said, takes him under his wing. And Barras also eventually passes on to Napoleon his own former mistress, Rose de Beauharnais, who becomes known as Josephine. But most importantly, Barras gives Napoleon the ability gives him the job of helping to suppress a series of royalist riots in Paris in the fall of 1795. And Napoleon takes care of this very effectively, quite brutally. opening fire on a royalist crowd with grape shot from a cannon. So at this point, he is now, very, very highly regarded by the authorities in Paris. And to jump ahead a couple of steps, in the spring of 1796, Napoleon is appointed to head. He's now given the rank of Major General, and he's appointed to head one of the major armies that will lead France in its continuing war against the forces of the coalition that is opposed to France, the Army of Italy. So this is now the spring of 1796. He's still, at this point, he is only 26 years old, but he's a major general and in command of one of the most important French armies.
And what made Napoleon stand out as a general? As a 26-year-old, but also later in life, just in general.
One of the things about Napoleon is that, you read the propaganda about him, the propaganda generated about him, and it makes him look like a Superman, right? It makes him look like, the most amazing character who ever lived.
Yeah, the cover on your book, he looks like a superhero.
And his own propaganda is extremely good, so it's very effective in making him look heroic. But the one thing where the propaganda really was actually entirely correct is he is a military genius. I mean, there's no question about that. He is somebody he has a very, very high, high level of pure intelligence. He is personally brave, which actually does matter to keep your cool in the middle of a battle, even if you're a little withdrawn from the fighting. But he has a remarkable capacity to just keep in his head the position of all the different units involved in a battle at any one time. And that is actually incredibly difficult. I mean, you may be commanding, at the beginning of his career as a general, he's commanding tens of thousands of troops. By the end, it will be hundreds of thousands. They're spread out often over several miles on a battlefield. Obviously, they don't have electronic communications. He has runners who come back and forth, giving him reports, but sometimes the runners will get shot. Sometimes they won't. They will get lost. Sometimes he will be lucky enough to be able to see the entire battlefield. Sometimes he can't from the position he's in. Often the battlefield is covered in smoke because this is a period when the army uses gunpowder, which generates a huge amount of smoke. Smokeless gunpowder comes in later. It's a technological innovation of the 19th century. So it's very, very tricky to keep all of this in your head, all of this, and to see a way to actually concentrate your key units at just the right moment, at exactly the weak spot in the enemy's lines. This is not easy. This is not easy at all. And he is simply better at it than anybody else. And over the course of his career, he fights, about, probably 70 major battles. And he wins a very, very high percentage of these, probably a much higher percentage than almost any other general of the time. So this is one thing which makes him a great commander. Simply his sheer military intelligence is one. Another is that he really knows how to motivate his soldiers. For him, always, the well-being of his soldiers is top priority, which was not always the case. I mean, in the 18th century, most soldiers in European armies were professional soldiers. They were in it for life. They had a very, very bad reputation. The apocryphal sign over a British pub saying "no dogs, no whores, no soldiers" probably reflects the reality pretty accurately for the way that the population saw most professional soldiers. Then, with the French Revolution, you have suddenly an army of conscripts, a huge army of people who are often, when they come into the army, they have very little training, and the army is really struggling, and the French Revolutionary armies struggled enormously to keep their soldiers fed, to keep them in uniform, to keep them equipped, to give them very basic things like shoes. We don't think about shoes as being so important these days, but of course soldiers marched across Europe on foot. They would wear out their shoes pretty quickly. So shoes were an absolute necessity. Otherwise, the soldiers would be marching and developing foot sores very quickly. So particularly remember, they're also carrying often 60, 70 pounds heavy packs on their back. So Napoleon just always made it a priority to give his soldiers the best food that they could find, the best uniforms, and he would do this, if necessary, by stripping the countryside around him, by simply expropriating everything very brutally from the territories he was in. But he would do this. And so he's able to inspire the soldiers. He gives the soldiers rewards. He gives them marks of honor, whether ceremonial swords or medals. He's always there to congratulate people in person. He is very present among his soldiers. He remembers them. He has a great memory. He remembers individuals. And he'll go up and say, yes, you were with me at Marengo. Yes, yes, sire, yes, and so on and so forth. So that is, I think, a second part of it. And then the final thing, I think, which is also very important, is that he is a very good propagandist. Because, not only is he very good in actually fighting the battles, but he's very good in sort of presenting the battles as great victories. And this, for particularly before he comes to power, very important that he convince the authorities back in Paris how brilliant he is and how successful he is. And he does this very, very well. And then, when he's fighting against the masses of the massed forces of Europe, he generates a propaganda that really does quite a lot to demoralize the enemy by presenting him as being so, absolutely, kind of Superman-like. So I think you put all these things together and you get somebody who's a very, very, very effective general.
Would it be fair to say that Napoleon was a great storyteller?
Oh, absolutely, yes. Again, and this is partly where his training as a writer really came in hand. So he writes a lot, he gives great speeches, he comes up with a lot of memorable lines. Of course, this has always been added to, so a lot of the quotes that are attributed to Napoleon, he didn't actually say, but he did say a lot of them. When he gets to Egypt, he makes an address to his soldiers literally in the shadow of the pyramids, and he says, "Soldiers, 40 centuries are looking down on you." I mean, that's pretty, that's a pretty good line. And one of many, many that he knew how to use. He would write bulletins. He was an extremely good storyteller, particularly about himself, his favorite subject.
And also, as in painting-wise, right?
Oh, absolutely. So he was absolutely aware of the importance of visual propaganda. So he would have, some of the most remarkable paintings of his period are of him. He was able to sort of seduce and to get cooperation from the greatest French painters of the day, Jacques-Louis David, Antoine Jean Gros, Ingres, many others, to paint him, in heroic poses. The most famous painting of all is the one that shows him, is adorned 1,000,000 brandy bottles. It shows him on a rearing horse in the Alps. I mean, he actually, went across the Alps. This is in 1800. He went across the Alps on a mule, wrapped in a blanket because it was so cold. But, for David, he puts him on this grand horse, in the footsteps of Hannibal. And it's amazingly effective. Of course, a limited number of people would see the paintings themselves, although the really important people in Paris would see the paintings. But then the paintings would be engraved, and copies of them would go out, to hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people would see images of Napoleon, if not the actual paintings.
And to get back on morale for a second, you were talking about how he motivated his soldiers. And one of the ways he did it is also by really being in a battlefield, right? Like showing his soldiers, like, you guys aren't the only ones struggling. I'm with you in this.
So one of the most famous stories about Napoleon, and again, one of the true stories, as opposed to the many fake stories that go around, is that at the Battle of Lodi in 1796, he's trained as an artillery officer, right? So he knows how to fire a cannon. And at one point, some of the cannon crew near him are killed or wounded, and he steps in and helps load the cannon himself. And the cannon crew sort of jokes with him, "Well, you're doing a very good job. Maybe we'll name you our new corporal." And so he gets the nickname of the Little Corporal, and that of course sticks to him. And he does have real personal bravery. I mean, one thing that you have to say about him, he comes close to death dozens of times during his career. He's wounded a couple of times. At the Battle of Toulon, he's stabbed in the thigh. He's knocked off his horse many times. He comes within a hair's breadth of being shot, but he's always present. He's not afraid to risk, death or severe bodily harm. So and that means a lot to the soldiers as well, because most generals lead from behind; they are safely in their tent, and he's not. If you look at the new film by Ridley Scott, it shows him actually on a horse leading a cavalry charge. That's ridiculous, because he was a cavalry officer. He was not actually a very good, horseback rider, and he wouldn't have exposed himself in that way. He doesn't generally as a general, he doesn't take part generally in the hand-to-hand fighting, no, but he is there among the troops, absolutely.
And like tactical, military-wise, how big was the advantage that he was able to move with speed?
That was very, very important. So and again, it's partly the fact that he's able to inspire his soldiers. It's partly the fact that he's able to train his soldiers so well. And he puts an enormous amount of effort into training as well. So here's the most famous example. So in 1805, Napoleon has been considering invading Britain, and amasses an army basically on the shores of France, about 21, 22 miles from Dover. But he can't get to Britain because he doesn't have a fleet that can protect a flotilla so he can't protect his soldiers being taken over to Britain. So he abandons that idea. He decides he's going to march this army into Germany to confront the forces of the Austrian Empire. And at this point, these soldiers are as well trained as they've ever been. They are tough. So they're wearing, packs that probably weigh as much as 80 pounds on their back. And he's able to march them sometimes as much as 30, 35 miles a day. And people just don't believe this. I mean, some of the opposing generals, they think, okay, he'll be here in a month, and he's there in 2 weeks. I mean, and they can, and so he's able to make, very good use of this speed, because again and again, he shows up where people don't expect him to show up. In 1800, he shows up at Marengo. The Austrians don't really expect him there. In 1805, he shows up at Ulm. The Austrians General Mack does not expect him to be coming so quickly with so many men, and so on and so forth. At Austerlitz, he's coming uphill out of a cloud bank with the sun behind him. It's an absolutely stunning moment. And again, these soldiers are well trained, they are well drilled, they know how to move, and they move.
He's obviously like seen as one of the greatest, but often people forget about the marshals too, right? I know that Andrew Roberts, one of the most famous biographers of Napoleon, is currently writing a book about his marshals. What do you think the impact of the marshals was, and like all the great plans of Napoleon, were they discussed with his marshals, or was he often just doing his own thing and strategizing on his own?
I mean, these are very large organizations that he's involved in, right? I mean, so he needs, and it's not just the marshals. He has a staff, essentially. I mean, it's not a kind of modern, sort of military, staff of the sort the Germans would bring in the late 19th century. But he has his chief aides. He has particularly, Berthier, and he has, of course, these marshals who are. He has members of his family, of course, also, who are a kind of kitchen cabinet for him often. And he has his marshals, and his marshals are really quite extraordinary as well. Again, they're all a product, or almost all a product, of this remarkable moment in the French Revolution, when suddenly the top ranks of the army all retire or leave, and you have this incredible range of promotions, so that people are able to, so these people, his marshals are all very young, like he is. These are not grizzled old generals. These are young hotshots. And they're all very good. They're all very inspired by him. So people like Joachim Murat, who becomes his brother-in-law, who then becomes king of Naples, or General Brune, one of the lesser-known ones, but really quite an extraordinary military man. General Ney, who's known as the bravest of the brave, and so on and so forth. And they copy him also. I mean, they are inspired by him, but they also imitate him. So they learn from him. They run their divisions or their units the way that Napoleon runs the army. They care for their soldiers in the same way. They try to apply the same strategy and tactics. Not all of them are quite so brilliant, and particularly members of his family often let him down. I mean, he spends half of the Russian campaign raging against his brother Jerome, who is not a very, particularly good general. But most of the marshals are very good.
Is it true that Napoleon chose his generals on basis of like how lucky they were, or is it more like a rumor?
I mean, one of the quotes attributed to Napoleon is probably fake. Is that that what general needs luck above everything else? I mean, but did he have a degree of superstition? Yes, but was it enough to really dictate everything? No. I mean, he picked generals who knew how to fight.
And what was Napoleon's relationship with like destiny? Because I don't know if you know the book. It's called In the Mind of Napoleon. You probably know it, and in it I often see the word destiny appear. Right?
So so again, it's part of the image that he himself helped to create, right? I mean, so he writes it several times, and so looking back on his career later, he says at several points that at the Battle of Lodi, 1796, it came to him that he was destined for the greatest possible things, that he had a star guiding him. Um, did he actually come to that realization exactly at that moment? Hard to know. But when you think about it, again, here he is. He's 26. He's a major general, for God's sake. He is, and then within a year and a half, he leads what is actually the most successful French military campaign ever in history up to this point. For centuries, the French had ambitions in Italy. back to Francois I in the early 16th century, back before that. And they all fail, more or less. I mean, and Napoleon, he doesn't fail. He succeeds. He conquers all of northern Italy by 1796 to 99 is called in Italy the Triennio, because it's a period of domination by the French Republic.
Mhm.
Um, and then in 1799, he's barely 30 years old, and he actually seizes power in France. He becomes first consul. He how can you not think that you're destined,
Mhm.
that fate and destiny are playing a part when you have that kind of extraordinary success within the first 3 decades of your life? How could you not?
Yeah, definitely true. And because it kind of goes against how Napoleon felt as a child, right? But why do you think he wanted to become like emperor, get the title of emperor, especially because he was a part of the revolution too?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, and it's one which which goes back to a question which historians often ask, which is Napoleon the person who fulfills the French Revolution, or is he the person who buries the French Revolution? And I think the answer effectively is both,
Okay.
because there's a lot of the French Revolution that he remains committed to. And there's certainly also, I mean, you can come up with real Napoleon quotes for anything. So that in 1804, Napoleon actually orders the kidnapping and execution of a leading member of the Bourbon family who's been plotting against him, the Duc d'Enghien. This is something that actually shocks European opinion, that he simply has basically this opponent assassinated. And afterwards, in defending himself, he says, "I am the French Revolution. Je suis la Révolution française." And then when he is, much later, when he's going to, when he's en route to Saint Helena in his final exile, he says to a British surgeon on the boat he's on, he says, I found the crown of France in the gutter. I cleaned it off and I put it on my head.
Mm.
Um, and although when he's saying that, he also says just before that, it's the line which is never quoted, but he says to this doctor, he says, I had been chosen by the people. So even there, he's still saying that he had popular legitimacy. But he is committed to certain revolutionary principles. He's committed to equality before the law. He's committed to sort of meritocracy. He wants to abolish, sort of inherited privilege, at least to a certain extent. He's committed to, to the rule of reason. But at the same time, by the time we get to 1804, he's already effectively king in all but name. In 1802, he becomes consul for life, which has already made him, essentially a monarch.
Was it inspired by Caesar, you think?
Oh, very much inspired by Caesar,
Okay.
certainly. Yes, absolutely. I mean, Caesar is always the sort of image of Caesar is always behind Napoleon, because all through the French Revolution, there's a period when the French revolutionaries are all saying, "We know how the Roman Republic ended. It ended with Julius Caesar, and we don't want this to happen again," which is one of the reasons why there's a great suspicion of generals all through. And
Mhm.
finally, there's a kind of switch by 1788, 1798, 99, when people are saying, "Look, everything is so chaotic. Maybe we do need a general after all." So he's very, very cognizant of Caesar, and of Augustus then as well.
Okay.
But at the same time, what's more important, I think, at this point are two things. Why he wants to become emperor. First is and probably most important, is he feels that at this point, if he wants to actually be able to deal with other European monarchs on a kind of even level, on the same level, he needs that title. If he wants to deal with Alexander, the Tsar of Russia, with the King of England, with the Emperor of Austria, he can't do that as a consul, because it's simply not what European politics is set up for. And the second question, very important, is the question of the succession. Because, again, as I've said, he risks his life a lot. In 1800, he barely escapes an assassination attempt in Paris. What's going to happen in France if he falls from power? His younger brother Lucien is sort of hinting at, well, I could come in. And then he has his stepson, Eugène de Beauharnais, who's saying, well, I could come in. Um, but he's getting increasingly nervous about this, increasingly worried not only that it would affect France after he goes, but that the worry about it would affect France even while he's still there. So for these two reasons, he decides, taking counsel from many people around him, that it makes sense to be a monarch. But he's not going to be a king, because that ship has sailed, and that title is stained, as far as he's concerned, is tarnished by the fact that that he's still the representative of the revolution that overthrew the French kings. So
Mhm.
he's not going to be king; he'll be emperor. But I think that was overdetermined.
And what was the reaction of the French population? Were they quite positive about it, or do they feel like a sense of mm, like they've been played?
Well, it's hard to judge necessarily what most of the population felt. We don't have opinion polls. We have reports of spies who worked for the government. Um, I think most people at this point, most people sort of resign themselves to it as an inevitability. I
Okay.
think that certainly this was at the high point of his career. He was really, this is really the greatest period of his success, or almost. I mean, the really greatest period would come in 1805, 1806, after the Battle of Austerlitz, after the battles of Jena and Auerstedt. But he's flying very high, so that he's very popular. He's brought France incredible victories. He's brought France a great degree of prosperity. He has ended the chaos of the revolution. He has restored security. He's done so at the price of liberty. He's done so by basically instituting a dictatorship. Although it's not a totalitarian dictatorship, and it's not a hugely repressive dictatorship. He's not throwing thousands of people in jail. He's not executing thousands of people. So while it's repressive, and while there's censorship and certainly no free elections, it's as far as dictatorships go, Europe has seen a lot worse. So while there is certainly a hardcore, there are two centers of opposition. Of course, there are people who are still committed to the French Revolution. There are people who are committed to the old monarchy. Um, but those groups are pretty well marginalized by this point, and most people think, all right, this is what we got. We have Napoleon. We don't want chaos after he goes. We want an orderly succession. So I think most people in France, a lot of people are enthusiastic about it, and a lot of people are resigned to it. And there are not a lot of people who are actively opposed to it at the time.
Mm. You just mentioned 1805 to 1806. Could you describe to us what happened during that period? Because it's one of the most famous periods in Napoleon's life.
Sure, absolutely. So in that period, he wins really his greatest victories. So a number of European coalitions have fought against France, and by 1804, 1805, we're up to what's called the Third Coalition. It's the one that forms after the breakdown of the brief peace with Britain, the Peace of Amiens. It's also shaped by his greatest, most significant defeat, which is the defeat at Trafalgar, where the French and Spanish allied fleets are decimated by Lord Nelson. And
Mm.
this is actually a very important moment because he had thought at least of trying to resuscitate a Franco-American empire, an empire for France in the Americas based on Saint-Domingue and Haiti, and that's now that's completely gone. He is thinking about possibly establishing more of an overseas empire in Asia or in Africa. That's gone at this point with the end of Trafalgar, and he wants to invade Britain, and he can't do it because he has no fleet to protect his troops. So that's gone. So he turns his attention entirely to the European continent at this point, and his major opponent there is Austria. Um, and in 1805, as I've mentioned, he marches the troops that had been preparing to invade Britain and marches them into Germany, has a stunning defeat of Austria at the Battle of Ulm, and then a year later he faces or not a year later, sorry, just a brief period later, he faces the combined forces of Austria and Russia at the Battle of Austria in what is now the Czech Republic in Moravia.
Mhm.
And that is one of his single most brilliant military victories. He decimates the Austrian and Russian forces. He is able to then triumphantly basically march into Vienna and dictate terms to the Austrian emperor. After some more very difficult fighting, he's able to defeat the Russians convincingly as well. Their army is already pretty much decimated after Austerlitz. And then in 1806, he fights yet another. This is now what's called the Fourth Coalition, and he
Mhm.
fights this time against Prussia, the leading power in Germany, in northern Germany, and he defeats the Prussians, who had been considered, from the time of Frederick the Great, the most innovative and important, and successful European land army, and he decimates the Prussians at these twin battles at Jena and Auerstedt, and is able to dictate terms to the Prussia, where Prussia actually loses half of its territory. And then soon after this, he actually meets the emperors of Austria and Russia on a raft in the Niemen River that's called Tilsit. He's able to basically meet them as a brother emperor. Again, it's why the title is so important to him.
Mhm.
Meanwhile, the King of Prussia is kept on the banks of the river sort of just watching helplessly
Because of
while.
his title?
I'm sorry, what?
Because of his title?
Not so much because of his title, because he had lost so badly.
Okay.
At this point, 1807, I mean, 1806, 1807, Napoleon is really, at his zenith at this point. He really is. And again, it's because of these stunning military victories, which have given him essentially control of the entire European continent. The borders of France have expanded at this point to include what's now Belgium and Luxembourg, the German Rhineland, portions of Alpine Italy. He has, basically the Netherlands very quickly become a satellite kingdom under his brother Louis. Northern Italy becomes a kingdom under his direct rule, though he gives his stepson Eugène de Beauharnais the viceroyalty of Northern Italy. Southern Italy becomes a kingdom under his brother Joseph, and then Austria and Prussia are reduced to basically vassal states, and Russia remains at peace with him. So it's really quite an extraordinary moment for him.
And what was Napoleon's relationship with Tsar Alexander?
So Napoleon had a certain, I mean, of all the European monarchs whom he dealt with, I think he had the greatest sort of envy, in a sense, of Alexander for commanding these absolutely vast territories, for ruling as a complete autocrat, with absolute control. He did think, in order to guarantee the succession, one thing that he had to do was to divorce his wife, Josephine, who had not been able to bear him children, and he needed to marry into one of the great European families. And he initially wanted to marry the sister of Tsar Alexander. It didn't work out.
He declined, Alexander, or what happened?
Alexander did decline, yes. And religion was also an issue there. I mean, Napoleon is Catholic, obviously, the Russian royal family is not. He did really want, in a sense, Alexander's approval as much as anybody's, and really sought to sort of portray himself to Alexander as a brother emperor. So yes, he did have, and of course he was disappointed in that relationship, as in so many.
And to skip 5 years ahead, so in 1812, the Russian invasion happens, one of the most famous moments in Napoleon's life too. Now, looking back at it in like 2024, it kind of seems like a stupid idea to invade Russia, right? But like, or no, is that a false thing to say?
Well, I mean, I teach a course in military history to my undergraduates at Princeton, and I always say there are two basic, rules in world history of warfare. One, don't invade Russia, and two, never, ever, ever invade Afghanistan.
Okay.
So, was it a good idea? No. But let's remember why he did it and what he was aiming at, because people often get confused by this. When they think about invasions of Russia, they think about Hitler, they think about Napoleon. If they're really historically well informed, they think of Charles XII of Sweden, a century before Napoleon. Now, there's a real big difference between Hitler and these other guys. Because Hitler wanted to conquer Russia. Hitler wanted to conquer Russia and to enslave the population and basically resettle it with German peasants. Napoleon didn't want to do that. He had no desire to make Russia a part of France, or to enslave the population. What he wanted to do is he wanted to defeat the Russian army. Why did he want to do this? Well, Napoleon was still at war with Britain. Britain was, impervious to conquest by France because they controlled the seas. Napoleon, felt that the only way he could defeat the British, his major remaining enemy, was by strangling their economy. The only way he could do that was by strangling their trade, and that meant cutting off the European continent to their exports. The British were manufacturing a lot at this time. They were also re-exporting a lot of things that they were basically getting from Asia and from the Americas and re-exporting to Europe. So how do you do this? Well, you basically create what Napoleon called the continental system, which means essentially cutting off the entire European continent from Britain. But the European continent is pretty big. It's got a lot of coastline, tens of thousands of miles of coastline. So this led Napoleon into his first big mistake, which was invading Iberia, because the Spanish had, while technically allies, were not really cooperating with him, and the Portuguese were essentially a British satellite state, and so allowing a lot of British goods to come into the continent through Portugal. So he invades Portugal through Spain. In order to consolidate his hold on Portugal, he invades Spain, and this already sets up a huge guerrilla war and a tremendous morass into which he's dragged for many years. And the Russians are also not cooperating, and the Russians are hesitating on whether they really want to be friendly to France. And so Napoleon decides that in order really to get control of Europe, he needs to defeat the Russians. He doesn't need to conquer them. He just needs to basically knock their army out of commission. So he decides he's going to deliver this knockout blow. He lines up 650,000 men on the borders with Russia and invades. And he thinks this will overwhelm them. He will march quickly. He counts on his speed. He will march quickly into Russia, defeat the Russian army, dictate terms to Tsar Alexander, and everything will be hunky-dory. And it wasn't an entirely ridiculous idea, not as ridiculous as Hitler trying to go in 1941. But to do it, he had to catch the Russian army and he had to defeat them decisively, and he couldn't manage it. And the Russians do what they were best, advised to do, which is retreat. They kept retreating ahead of him. Napoleon goes in, he gets to Smolensk, and he burns Smolensk, and he's still not able to catch them. Finally, he catches the Russian army at Borodino, right outside of Moscow. But by this point, his army has already been very badly decimated. People think, when you talk about Napoleon's Russian campaign, people think of the Russian winter. But the Russian summer that preceded it was actually just as bad. The Russians had left scorched earth behind them. There was very little drinkable water. There was, half the French army was drinking contaminated water and got dysentery. Mostly not a French army, by the way. There was a majority of Germans in the army. They couldn't find food easily. A lot of people died of disease. A lot of people simply dropped out or dropped dead along the way. So by the time he gets to Borodino, the French army is already quite depleted. And they fight at Borodino, and and he wins, but he doesn't win decisively enough. The Russian army is able, under Kutuzov, to withdraw in good order. And they withdraw to Moscow, then they withdraw beyond Moscow. They actually abandon Moscow. And Napoleon invests Moscow in the fall of 1812. But then Moscow burns. Whether or not it's deliberately set by the Russians, the fire probably was. We're not completely sure. Or whether it's an accident because of all the confusion. In any case, the city, which is mostly a wooden city, burns. And Napoleon finds that he cannot stay in Moscow with the winter coming. He decides he's going to leave. He dithers. Finally, he leaves. He leaves a little too late, and the winter comes too early, and the rest of the army is decimated on the retreat. And this becomes his single greatest disaster.
Yeah, because that's one of the points that I didn't know. So the winter came quite early, because that was going to be my next question: is what made Napoleon not leave Russia earlier, as he noticed that the Russians were retreating?
He thinks the winter will be, again. He's also, he's a Corsican. He doesn't really, even though he's fought at places like Eylau and knows how bad the cold can get, he's not really, he's not an expert on winter weather.
But he's read the biography of King of Sweden, right?
He's read about Charles XII. He's read, about it. But again, even, and he still has a lot of confidence in his men. But then, the winter comes early. That's also true. So all that again, it's the perfect storm. The army is decimated. Moscow burns. Winter comes early. Boom.
Ending, bum. I want to talk about Napoleon as a politician, because many forget about the Napoleonic Code, right? Could you tell me something about that and what the impact that has had for the hundreds of years to come?
So Napoleon is, of course, not just a great military figure. He's also a very talented politician. Again, he's an expert at propaganda. We've discussed this. He's very good at popularizing his victories, at presenting himself already in the late 1790s, at presenting himself as the savior of his country. And in that way, he's able to take over sort of the better elements of the story of Julius Caesar by saying that I will actually save France the way Caesar saved Rome. And and then when he takes power, he's very deft at, he appoints good people. He's ruthless when he needs to be, particularly in imposing censorship and imposing imposing real draconian autocracy in France. He's no Democrat, but at the same time he's able to he imposes order and security, which is what people want after a decade of revolutionary turmoil. So he knows what people want. He is always ready to pose as, in one sense, a kind of Democrat, because he always holds plebiscites to legitimize what he's done. So when he first seizes power as first consul, he holds a plebiscite to have people approve of his new constitution, and then he does the same thing when he becomes consul for life. So there's a patina of democratic legitimacy, which he always is very careful to keep over him. And even in 1804, when he becomes emperor, the act creating the empire literally begins. It says, quote, "The government of the republic is confided to an emperor."
Mm.
So, in other words, he's not ending the republic. He's not saying the republic is over. He's just saying the republic is taking on a new form, and I'm it, right? So there's that. And then he, is very, he's very energetic. I mean, one of the great lines about him, spoken by his advisor Talleyrand, is, "God, what a pity the man wasn't lazy." But he definitely wasn't lazy. He worked through the night. He worked, I mean, all these movies that show him, sort of mooning after Josephine. I mean, a real movie about Napoleon would be very boring because it would mostly show him at his damn desk, because he was at his desk all the time. And he introduces a whole panoply of reforms. He creates prefects for the departments, centralizing government more than it's ever been centralized in France. And he creates the Napoleonic Code, which is, France had this incredibly confused collection of different laws, some based on Roman law, some based on old French customary law. And he creates a commission, and he basically sits them down and forces them to come up with a new, very concise, rational, lucid, easy to follow law code, which becomes the law code for France, and is so good that dozens of countries around the world have taken it over, both in Europe, South America, even some in Asia. So, and even in the state of Louisiana in the United States have adopted the Napoleonic Code.
Oh wow, didn't know that.
He's really very good at that as well. And again, he maintains order. He maintains a degree of equality. He is very good at cultivating the support of what he calls the blocks of granite, which are the notables, the wealthiest families in France. And he cultivates their support by giving them all sorts of advantages, giving them access to their children, to the best schools, to arranging marriages between them to sort of consolidate their own alliances and their own control. So he's very, very good at that as well. And as long as the wars go well, and as long as he's bringing a lot of wealth and glory to France, he has a lot of popular support, and so he's able to do this. Eventually, things turn against him, and then it's not so good. But for a long time, he does remain legitimately very popular.
It's funny that you said that Napoleon wasn't lazy, because I was listening to this podcast once, and this podcast host was talking about if Napoleon lived in 2024, he'd probably be like a Twitter addict, same as Napoleon, how many letters he was sending to everyone. There have been like thousands of them being found.
Probably.
He'd be like Donald Trump, like tweeting all day, or Elon Musk, probably.
Except he'd also probably be doing stuff, unlike Trump. He wouldn't
Yeah.
just be tweeting. He'd also be like sending out orders and such. He could do both, unlike Trump.
What was like the long-term vision you think for Napoleon for France? Do you think he was even thinking about that, or was he living like really in the moment? Because he was nearly always fighting battles.
He was fighting battles, but no, he definitely had a long-term vision, and it was long-term vision was of Europe. There's a wonderful letter that he writes to Fouché, his police minister, where he basically describes the European Union. He says, we want to have, basically one state in Europe, one system of weights and measures, one currency, one dominant language, which of course would be French. He doesn't want to basically make everybody else French. He doesn't want to, do that. He wants to, he's people are happy to keep their local languages, their local educational systems, whatever. But he wants there to be, the same law code, and he wants basically the language of government and administration to be French, and he wants a kind of degree of European unity. He would also, he had moments where he still dreamed of imitating Alexander the Great, of conquering India. After Trafalgar in 1805, he basically gives up on this, but he does have a very strong vision of a kind of unified Europe under French control and dominated by the Bonaparte family.
Okay. So eventually in 1815, he gets exiled to St. Helena. And what I'm wondering is, do you think because Napoleon had like 5 years, right? 5 years he was in St. Helena to kind of like reminisce about the good old days and think about
6, he dies in 1821, yeah.
6 years. Okay. Do you think he eventually kind of hated the person he became? Because there is this quote, and actually you mentioned it in the beginning of the podcast or the interview. You said in your book, ambition, like all disordered passions, is a violent and unthinking delirium, like a fire fed by a pitiless wind. It only burns out after having consumed everything in its path. And eventually, obviously Napoleon is famous for being one of the most famous, ambitious people of all time. Do you think, looking back in Saint Helena, he was like, young Napoleon would not be proud of who I became?
Oh God, no, no. He was
No.
very proud of who he'd become. I
Hmm.
mean, he's defeated. He's depressed. He is confused. He's very angry at the British. Not for not necessarily for beating him, but for not treating him with the proper respect. So particularly when Hudson Lowe becomes the commander on St. Helena, Hudson Lowe refuses to call him emperor. He calls him General Bonaparte, and
Mm.
Napoleon can't stand that. He wants to be emperor. But no, I mean, all the time on St. Helena, I mean, in one sense, he accepts what happened. I mean, he's a general. He knows that, that he could lose. He doesn't, he's not a conspiracy theorist. He's not raging against people for betraying him very much, a little bit, but not very much. He accepts that he was defeated, but he still dreams of his legacy. But he wants to preserve his legend and his legacy. So most of the time that he's on St. Helena, he's surrounded by a group of loyal officers who have come with him, and he spends
Mhm.
most of his time basically, monologuing to them, talking about his career and reliving the great moments of it.
Mhm.
Um, occasionally saying, "Yeah, this was a mistake, that was a mistake," but mostly saying, "Oh, look what happened here and look what happened there," and going on and on and on. And it's very funny because these officers there, they all have basically pens and paper and notebooks, and basically they'll listen to him for half an hour, and then they'll sort of dash off into the corner and quickly take notes because they all want to publish, right?
Uh-huh.
And Emmanuel de las Casas, who is who had never been an important figure under the empire, but who's accompanied him to St. Helena and is a member of the old French nobility. He takes the best notes and he goes back and he publishes first. And he publishes what becomes known as the Memorial of St. Helena, which which is a kind of weirdly disjointed book, which goes back and forth between basically verbatim reproductions of Napoleon's, sort of meandering monologues on the one hand, and then um, descriptions of Napoleon on St. Helena and his battles with Sir Hudson Lowe for respect. And this becomes the greatest bestseller of 19th century in France, this book, The Memorial of St. Helena. And it becomes really a kind of touchstone for all future French literature in a way.
Okay, so because you also mentioned that Napoleon, thank God he wasn't lazy, right? Is that how he kept himself busy during Saint Helena, or did he eventually become kind of lazy? Because we all know those famous pictures of him becoming a little fat, right, at the end of his life.
He was already fat. He was already fat. I
Okay.
mean, I mean, he's a middle-aged guy. He's not actually getting a lot of exercise. He can eat whatever he wants.
Yeah.
He was already quite tubby before he goes to St. Helena. Um, you know, he, you know, he still has a lot of energy, probably until the last year or two.
Hmm.
Um, not only does he, I mean, he brings a library with him too. He's able to bring a library of books, including like a lot of the French classic theater books,
Hmm.
theatrical plays, and he bores his little entourage to death by sort of insisting that they do readings of Racine and Molière and Corneille and things like that. And he's constantly sort of reading and talking. So yeah, he still has a fair amount of energy until the end. But the last year or two, I mean, he's probably already under the effects of the stomach cancer that will kill him, and so he slows down. But for a long time, on Saint Helena. He's still pretty much. I mean, his symbol, one of his principal symbols, is the bee, and he was very much a busy bee.
Mm. What a novel his life was. Um, I want to finish off the podcast with a question, and that's because I think most people that are listening right now, they would like some more information. And besides reading your book, A Concise Biography by Napoleon, what other books would you recommend for listeners to read into of Napoleon?
Well, there are two really good, very long biographies in English, both of which are published within the last decade or so. One is by
Mhm.
Philip Dwyer, three actually, yeah, it's three large volumes about Napoleon. The other is by Michael Browers, Broers, and those are both terrific, comprehensive, very comprehensive. Andrew Roberts has written a one-volume biography called in Britain, Napoleon the Great. It's very energetic. It's very well written. It's a lot of fun. It's I think less well balanced than the others. Roberts is a rather interesting case. He's a British conservative, Tory, who earlier in his career, sort of, would make nasty remarks about Napoleon and the European Union when he was, in favor of Brexit, and clearly was no great fan of Napoleon. But then when he started to write his biography, and he's not a French history expert the way Dwyer and Brouwers both are, but when he does very good research. But when he started to do his research on Napoleon, he completely fell under the spell of Napoleon. So the book is very worshipful.
Mhm.
So, well, again, it's probably a kind of lighter read than Brouwers or Dwyer, although they're both perfectly good writers. I would say that Roberts is actually less less
Less
just less
balanced.
balanced.
Have you seen the debate that Andrew Roberts did with one author? I can't remember his name, but he also wrote a book about Napoleon, and they were basically like arguing if Napoleon is allowed to be called Napoleon the Great, yes or no. Have you seen that one?
Not seen that. I've heard about
I
it.
recommend you watching it. It's quite funny, actually.
No, Roberts is a great speaker. As I said, he's very funny, and and he's a very lively writer. But I would say just read with caution is what I would say.
I want to thank you for your time. If anyone's interested in the book, I'll link it in the description. And thank you, David, for your time.